Hello and welcome to Classics Unraveled, where we look at modern media and the classics they rip off and decide if they rip them off correctly. The man before you is John Christensen, and he's about to start talking. When I was a kid, young adult fiction had its day in the sun. If you know anything about a certain Harry J. Potter, then you know that the early 2000s were awash with kid-friendly fantasies where young protagonists discovered wonderful worlds of magic and mystery. There are easily hundreds of such books, and far be it from me to know how often these books played with classical mythology. But one series definitely did, and it came closer than most to rivaling the popularity of Mr. Potter. I refer, of course, to Percy Jackson and the Olympians, which says goodbye to witches and wizards and hello to Greek gods and demigods, putting them in the present day but still pitting them against harpies and hydras and all the creepy crawlies of classical lore. It may all be a shameless shot by the author, Rick Riordan, to taste a little bit of that Hogwarts honey. But as a teacher of the classics, I appreciate how many of my students cut their teeth on these books to learn the tales of antiquity. I'm happy to let students learn something about classical storytelling from their pop culture of choice. Even so, I do find myself having to reteach them much of what these books taught them. Clearly, something is lost in translation, so I don't know for sure whether Percy Jackson is a greater help than harm for the young classical scholar. So, it's about time I put Mr. Riordan under the magnifying glass, or his books at least, and see how well a best-selling children's author deals with the Greco-Roman mythos. Let's find out if Percy Jackson, a story with its feet squarely in the classics, qualifies as classical itself. I like to go into this show with some idea of the point I want to make, but this time I'm going in blind. You see, I've never read the Percy Jackson series. I certainly haven't seen the movies, and since they only made 2 of them, they're probably pretty bad. In any case, there's no use talking about the books until I know it's in them. See you on the other side. All right, I have thoughts. Let's start at the top, shall we? In the first book, Percy Jackson discovers that he is the son of Poseidon, god of the sea, and thus that the Greek gods and everything that comes with them are real. He's whisked away to Camp Half-Blood, a magical summer camp/training ground for young demigods like himself. He gets to know some of his campmates, complete with bumbling sidekick and romantic interest, the things you expect from these sort of books, shortly before he is accused of stealing the thunderbolt of Zeus, and he goes on an adventure across the United States to seek the true thief and recover the legendary bolt. The straightforwardness of its plot and the simplicity of its prose aren't breaking any land speed records here. This is ketchup and mustard, kid-friendly fare, and doesn't pretend otherwise. But I must constrain myself to commenting on the classical content, and as far as that's concerned, it's all about the characters. Of course, Riordan makes a lot of conventional choices for his cast. You've got Zeus and Hades, you've got centaurs and satyrs, you've got the Minotaur and Medusa. And yet, every now and then, he pulls in some really deep cuts. I didn't expect Procrustes to show up, and I'll admit, I didn't remember who that was until his scene got going. And as a teacher, I was always surprised when my students knew about the death of Pan, which is an obscure reference, but it turns out that Riordan deals with that at length in The Lightning Thief. So, hats off for stumping the band with the breadth of his references. But what about their depth? Is Medusa used to any greater purpose than just turning people into stone? Is a satyr used to any better effect than just being really into nature? No, they're not. Most of the time, each of these characters simply gets their own chapter-long encounter where there's a quick conflict and resolution, and then the protagonists leave. They're mini-bosses in a video game, not thematic statements of any kind. At best, they're exact retellings of their respective myth, with perhaps the fish-out-of-water novelty of showing up in a modern American scene. That's about as far as they go, disconnected plot points floating independently of one another. There's no addition to the theme, no linking of modern truths to ancient ones, with myths as the chain between them. And without that, a reference is merely a reference. Here's the big thing. Any guesses on who the bad guy is in this story? If you said Hades, you'd be right. For about the first half of the book, until, surprise, it's actually Kronos, the Titan god of time. Hades and Cronus are not the bad guys of Greek mythology. Why is this such a common trope in adapting the Greek mythos? Why does Disney's Heracles do it? Why does Clash of the Titans do it? Attempting to apply a conventional good and evil framework to the gods of Greece is a false dichotomy and risks teaching the wrong lessons about the classical archetypes at play. Hades was not a rival of Zeus. He had his own affairs in the land of the dead and generally doesn't meddle. Cronus was Zeus's rival, but his main job was presiding over man's unfallen golden age. Reardon briefly refers to this, but more to say, yes, I know, I've done the research, but I want him to be evil. If anything, the one thing Hades and Cronus do have in common is their association with wealth. But that's entirely irrelevant to the treatment given by Percy Jackson. The Hades and Cronus that Reardon gives us are more referential to the pop culture versions of these characters, and that's a big strike against the authenticity of the series. One thing I do find intriguing is how Reardon plays with the concept of Western civilization itself. In the Jackson-verse, the supernatural entities that make up Western mythology sort of shift and adapt to the ebb and flow of Western history. So Mount Olympus has moved from Greece to the top floor of the Empire State Building. The gods of nature have diminished in the face of ecological disaster, and so forth. I was very tempted to count this as an asset of the books. But I got to thinking, which way should that cause and effect go? Should changes in the physical world be reflected in the mythological, or should it go the other way around? It depends on what we think about classical mythology. If myth is merely a matter of man's belief, if it's only as real as we treat it, then indeed Olympus and its denizens must wax and wane with the weight of our own thoughts. This is how it's done in other modern retellings, like Neil Gaiman's American Gods, and once again, Clash of the Titans. The gods' existence in those stories depends on the prayers of men, and as men turn away from them, they lose their strength and eventually their lives. But if we look at mythology as truth in the abstract, as the platonic forms for things that are real in smaller particular ways amongst men, then the rising and falling of mortal affairs should instead be the effect and not the cause of immortal happenings. This isn't a deal breaker for the series, classically speaking, as it's mostly a basis for Reardon's world building. But it does suggest that the idea of classical truth is not on the author's mind. Of the whole series, the second book is the most contrived. And by that, I mean, it feels the most like trying to cut the myths down to fit the author's own ideas instead of the other way around. The Sea of Monsters is basically a mashup of the Odyssey and the Argonauts. Percy and his companions go on a voyage to claim the Golden Fleece to protect Camp Half-Blood, facing many strange terrors along the way, and must free their friend from the Cyclops Polyphemus. He goes for it. And he does it, and he goes home. There you have it. There's not a lot here. There is this whole subplot about his rival, Clarice, searching for it first, and they need to join forces to succeed. But that's not a huge change to the through line of the thing. Now, granted, the myth-theme of the Great Voyage is certainly a valid one to work with. However, Percy's quest for the Golden Fleece really feels like an excuse to profit from the originals, rather than an expansion on the point of the originals. The Odyssey carries along a whole slew of big ideas, like the responsibilities of kingship and the conduct between guest and host, and the recognition of genius. And the Argonauts wrestle with how to deal with loss and what sort of crimes are redeemable, and what constitutes an outsider or a foreigner. None of this is accounted for in Percy Jackson. Once again, it is broad but not deep. Besides the physical tokens of the fleece and the ship, and a few familiar faces like Circe and Scylla and Charybdis, this is a quest for a magical object indistinguishable from any lesser tale of its kind, and deprived of the sort of things that make the greater of its kind. All this having been said, I really like what they do with Tyson. Not even from a classical standpoint. Tyson's great. If you haven't read the book, Percy finds out that one of his classmates in the regular world is secretly a young Cyclops, and more importantly, another son of Poseidon, making him Percy's half-brother. There are plenty of half-brothers Reardon could have chosen from the real mythology, because Poseidon has a lot of kids. Ignoring that, however, Percy spends a lot of time thinking about what it means that his father, with whom he'd like to have some kind of positive relationship, went and had a monster for a kid too. This affects how Percy treats Tyson, so now that relationship is just as rocky as the father-son relationship. There's a lot of texture there, more than I expected, and much more than anything else in the book. I'm more skeptical with how Riordan handles the family theme in later books, but in the specific case of Tyson, I was pleasantly surprised. In the third book, I should probably mention Luke. Back in the first book, when we found out that Cronus is the real antagonist, as much as I'm not okay with that, we found out that Luke, one of Percy's friends, is in fact an agent of Cronus because he resents his Olympian father, Hermes, for abandoning him, just as much as Cronus does for imprisoning him. In the second book, Luke is going around on a boat. And then in the third book, he is helping to restore the Titan's stronghold on Mount Orthrus, which Riordan puts in San Francisco, just like Olympus in New York City. Percy Jackson and company have to go on another transcontinental journey to stop Luke from awakening Cronus and unleashing his monstrous army. I know I read all these back to back, but this book in particular is the foggiest one for me. Plot-wise, there is not a lot going on that couldn't just as easily have been part of the book before it or the book after it. Its saving grace is that it finally begins digging into thematic soil in earnest, namely that it shows a series of parent-child relationships in varying degrees of disarray. Percy might get a new stepdad. Annabeth's estranged father is actually kind of okay. 2 new kids are orphans, and Luke has daddy issues. I want to talk about how these tie into the whole divine parentage thing later, because we don't really reach any conclusions at this point, but I appreciate the beginning of some continuity of thought. Speaking of divine parentage, though, it's in the Titan's Curse that we finally get an answer to how Percy's crush, Annabeth, was born to a mortal man and to the goddess Athena. Now, Athena is famously a virgin goddess, which means this should be a major red flag when we first find this out in Book 1. But Books 1 and 2 do not address it, and in Book 3, we get a pretty lousy workaround. That's more of an excuse than an explanation. It certainly doesn't add anything to the story, much less to the real parent-child theme that's begun to arise in the book. This daughter of Athena business, though, is probably the best indicator that something's wrong with the series. It really looks like Riordan is breaking Athena's oath of chastity just for the sake of his own character's cool backstory. This isn't the first time where the rule of cool has bent or broken the mythology for no greater purpose than flavor. This book also heavily incorporates a character named Zoe, who turns out to be a secret lost sister of the Hesperides, for, again, no real reason except the Hesperides are cool. What does that say about the author's motivation? You either shape your story to honor the mythology, or you shape the mythology to honor your story. Riordan is definitely doing the latter, and while the result is usually pretty innocuous, the Athena thing is especially frustrating because it degrades something of great thematic interest and, one could argue, moral value in service of an inferior, relatively pointless aesthetic choice. While we're on this point, can we talk about how the demigods have superpowers? Percy is a son of the sea god, so he has a magical relationship to water and aquatic life. Annabeth is a daughter of the wisdom goddess. Again, problematic. So she has a thing for smarts and strategy. All the way down the line, if you have a godparent or a god parent, then whatever their domain is shapes your abilities and your personality, sometimes to the point of absurd stereotype. It's inauthentic, of course. Achilles, the world's greatest warrior, was not a son of Ares. For heaven's sake, Helen, the world's most beautiful woman, wasn't a daughter of Aphrodite. But it's not just inauthentic, it's counterintuitive to the growing theme of the story. If Percy Jackson is all about coming to terms with the challenges of parental relationships, making most of the characters one-dimensional reflections of their parents' most prominent traits does not serve that theme. Instead, there should be a cowardly son of Ares, or a sickly daughter of Apollo, or a goody two-shoes son of Dionysus. Demigods whose personalities don't reflect the strength of their parents' powers, but the void of their parents' absence. The fourth book has Percy Jackson delving into the Labyrinth, which now serves as a sort of global network of deadly catacombs. His job, this time, is to prevent Luke from finding Ariadne's string. In actual mythology, this is literally just a string that Theseus uses to tie to the door of the labyrinth and find his way back to the entrance. In Percy Jackson, though, it's a magical object that allows its user to navigate the labyrinth at will. I'm not usually a stickler for the authenticity of inanimate objects in literature. I think it's an easy way to make mountains out of molehills. So I'll merely comment that there's a big difference between taking measures to get where you started and taking measures to get to any destination. And as far as literary motifs go, Ariadne's string is pretty distinctly the former. However, more importantly, in this book, the string is a prime example of a MacGuffin. If you don't know what a MacGuffin is, it's an object that a story can't live without, but could also be any other object. So everybody's hunting Ariadne's string, but as conceived by Reardon, it could just as easily have been a magical compass or a magical anything, so long as it gets you where you want to go. There's nothing especially important about it being a string, much less one that belonged to Ariadne. In fact, Zeus's lightning bolt in Book 1 or the Golden Fleece from Book 2 were pretty conventional MacGuffins. Now, a MacGuffin can be a great asset to a story. The One Ring in The Lord of the Rings theoretically could have been any object, but that it is a ring is extremely significant in the Anglo-Saxon context of ring giving, with all its symbolism of authority and allegiance. The genie's lamp in Aladdin doesn't just drive the plot forward, but the way it operates reveals the character of those who use it, not to mention that it's essentially a character itself. Ariadne's string can quite easily be forgotten, and in fact is forgotten, as soon as the plot has passed beyond it. Another thing that is thrown away is a big revelation about Percy's mentor, the centaur, Chiron. It turns out that the big bad Kronos is actually Chiron's father, which is not a big surprise if you know your mythology, but in the book it's treated as this big end-of-chapter cliffhanger that means something serious about the future. But this ends up being another sour note because, A, nearly everyone in the story is a close relative. Percy Jackson is already Kronos' grandson, and the author doesn't try to wring any serious thematic angst out of that relationship. Reardon is selective in deciding when family ties matter and when they don't, which makes the whole familial theme in this series all the weaker. And B, the Chiron-Kronos conflict concludes in the final book, where they come face to face for the first time, and Chiron says father, and Kronos says son, and they glower at each other until something else happens, and that's it. Choosing to make Chiron's parentage a point of conflict, which again was an arbitrary characterization, has no payoff. This is why the family theme that Reardon is angling at is so infuriating, because he moves the goalposts, seemingly to set up conflict resolutions, at the expense of the story's logical integrity, but then never resolves them. Anyway, there is one thing I like about the Battle of the Labyrinth, and that's Daedalus. The book spends a lot of time on Daedalus too, so the book's one saving grace is a significant one. Daedalus is the creator of the Labyrinth, whose workshop is somewhere at its center, and the adventurers are looking for him in hopes of his help against the forces of Kronos. But along the way, we get glimpses of the events that link the mythological Daedalus to Reardon's Daedalus, a mix of the original stories about the character and the author's own imaginings. The result is a genuine revision of the character, who in the myths is only noteworthy for his genius, but now takes on a bittersweet and sinister personal dimension, one that's not at odds and in fact fulfills the promise of the character. We see the original tales recast in terms of the suffering and loss of Daedalus, and how that transforms him into someone who is not a mere inventor, but someone capable of genuine malice, but also shame. By the time we meet him in the book, we've already seen his refreshingly organic transformation from a mere character cameo into a serious moral agent. His will and action in the story aren't just a caricature of a mad mythological scientist, but a portrait of human pathos. That is how you do classical adaptation. And if that's how Reardon dealt with his whole mythical cast, so that each one's new place in a modern world made better thematic sense than silly stereotypes, this would be a much better series. Finally, in the 5th book, you would be amazed at how little happens. I exaggerate slightly, as there are certainly a lot of steps to the plot of The Last Olympian. But in terms of meaningful happenings, I can summarize it very quickly. There's a pitched battle in the streets of New York City, which amounts to so many clashes where the two sides trade many blows but suffer few losses. It's the classic problem of fantasy combat. All the characters are superhuman, so combat usually means they smack each other around for a few minutes and then get back up, taunt each other, and fall back to plan the next fight. There are no clear stakes when the distinction between a flesh wound and a fatal blow is entirely up to the author's needs. This problem applies to the entire battle as well. There's no obvious relationship between the instances of fighting, where Percy Jackson and friends are usually successful, and the overall battlefield situation, where the villains are slowly but surely gaining ground. Again, it's all a matter of convenience. The author can't have Percy lose, but it's not going to be as tense if the good guys are winning all the time. So things get increasingly desperate for the good guys, despite winning every single encounter. Anyway, there's a final battle between Percy and Luke, who now is the vessel for Cronus, but Luke realizes the error of his ways and destroys himself to send Cronus back into the abyss. And if you think I missed some steps between the war and the final battle, I assure you, I just read this, and it does not deserve discussion. What does deserve discussion is what happens after the good guys win. Remember, up until now, Riordan has begun working in this thematic element of challenging family relationships, with several plot lines building up the degrees of parental absenteeism and abuse in the characters' lives. This all comes, of course, as a terrestrial parallel to the fact that most of the characters are demigods, with one immortal parent who usually has little contact in their mortal children's lives. The finale of the series, and Riordan's whole solution to all this familial trauma, is this. Percy is rewarded by the gods with a gift of his choice. Always a mistake. And instead of choosing to join his father as an immortal, Percy demands that the gods claim and care for all of their demigod children. Thematically speaking, that is a terrible conclusion. It sounds all well and good because, sure, parents should take care of their kids, but the parents are not the heroes of this story. It's not their actions that decide the good or evil outcome of the tale. This is a story about children, and the thing that determines the integrity of the story must be whether the unique excellences of the children are sufficient to overcome an unjust situation. It's their virtue that's on the line, and it's their virtue that spells the difference between victory and defeat. It certainly is their merits that bring the war to its conclusion. So to turn that upside down in the 11th hour to say, no, actually, it's our parents' job to make things right, is a really senseless and decidedly unclassical move. You see, in Greco-Roman myth, it doesn't matter whether it's a comedy or a tragedy. It's the traits of the protagonist that determine not just what happens, but what essential rights or responsibilities we have with respect to those traits. There are plenty of stories about abandoned children in the Greek mythos, and the outcome of those stories are beyond enumeration. But they all depend on how the protagonist, usually the child, but not always, how the protagonist acts in response to their unjust situation. If his misfortune becomes the basis for virtue, then misfortune ceases to be misfortune at all. If it spurs him on to vice, then necessarily it is the vice itself, not the circumstance, that spells his real doom. Oedipus didn't suffer because of his horrible fate, but rather his own pride in his intellect exposed him to those horrors. Medea wasn't destroyed by her husband's abandonment, but rather her own thirst for vengeance drove her to destroy herself. But in Percy Jackson, what does the heroism of Percy and friends actually accomplish in a moral sense? They physically stop Cronus from taking over the world. But what does that have to do with parentage? Was their early misfortune a pathway to those exact virtues with which they overcame that misfortune? No. Their bravery allowed them to overcome a physical threat, but it does not translate into a solution for the moral crisis of their families. Instead, Percy's summary of things suggests that it's the gods' fault that any of this happened in the first place. You can tell a story where the circumstance leads you to grow and overcome bad with good, or you can tell a story where things are just bad and they shouldn't be this way. You cannot do both. If Percy Jackson wins the right to blame the gods for his misfortune, but he wins it based on his personal triumphs that arose out of that situation, then he's self-defeating. On the level of parent and child, what should be an affirmation of young virtue becomes an incrimination of parental vice. On the level of God and man, it mistakes the occasion for human excellence as the outcome of divine indifference. And so it is with the Percy Jackson series. Riordan tries to infuse something like classical storytelling into his books, where the literal events evoke some essential truth about human experience. Unfortunately, his topic of choice, tying the god to demigod relationship to the challenges between parent and child, only slowly begins to pick up steam in the series, and at the very last moment is deflated with a distinctly postmodern message. It doesn't matter what children do in their quest for virtue in a world that doesn't always give them what they need, if, in the end, it's their parents' fault, and the answer is to stick it to the man. It's certainly true that parents' choices matter, but that is not the answer to the question that Riordan is asking throughout the books. And so he squanders a story in favor of shifting the responsibility of the protagonists elsewhere. Percy rejecting the chance to ascend to Olympus as an immortal is a fitting metaphor for the author making an inferior thematic choice that loses the thread of timelessness. So, in Daedalus fashion, the wax in Riordan's wings is insufficient to approach and abide in the light of the classics. If you liked today's video, then please drop a like in the like jar. And if you want to see what we unravel next, be sure to subscribe. I am John Christensen. Fare thee well.
So what would make Percy Jackson a classical timeless story?
I would have the ending, instead of going as it did, have the offer of immortality, right? To become a god. But then he would consult with other mortals turned gods. Heracles would be discussed. Ariadne would be discussed. He'd speak with them and say, you were men, you became gods. Why, right? What motivated that? I would think they would give their reasons. Their reasons would be so particular and so non-universal that he couldn't accept them as working for himself. And so you would simply say, I reject immortality, but not because my father is a bad god or a bad father, but because I am a man, I am a mortal, right? And my being Poseidon's son and my being a mortal man are not mutually exclusive. I'll remain what I am. And by remaining a man, I remain Poseidon's son as he had me. That will be the basis on which we have a relationship, because that is the basis on which my classical excellences arose. From there, perhaps an interstitial bit or a epilogue of showing perhaps Percy Jackson's personal life, right? Of his family life, of what his son would be like and how his relationship is affected by the relationship he had. But he wouldn't in any way incorporate some broad universal polemic against the gods as in some way justifying himself.